Well, thank you everybody for coming tonight. My name is Olga Peters. I am the senior staff writer for the Commons, a weekly, yes, hold up the beautiful, our beautiful creation. We are a weekly nonprofit in the area, just in case anyone has not read us. Make sure we come out on Wednesdays. So this is called The Art of the Interview, which was a great challenge for me, because although I do interviews every day, I never actually sat down and thought about how I do it. So, so I'd love to just take a couple minutes and see what brought people out here tonight, to see what interests you and how I can kind of sculpt this to your needs. So I'm going to pick on Joyce first. Oh, I'll pick on Judy first. Miss Judy.
Well, I think your paper is fantastic, and I think everybody should read it. It has so many different facets. But one thing I feel is that I'm amazed that it's free for those who want it to be free, but I think people need to know that they can subscribe. A lot of people just don't realize that it would help you if we subscribe.
Thank you for that. Yes, we are a nonprofit, so we sell advertising, but we can also take donations, and we have memberships similar to public radio, public television. But what brought you tonight specifically here, Judy?
Well, because I respect your writing, and I wanted to get to know you better.
Oh, thank you. How long have you been reading the Commons?
About as long as it's been published, I think.
Wow.
And I subscribe, so I get it in the mail.
Mm-hmm. And I've met you at a number of different events, like
League of Women Voters. Yeah.
Yep. And you're involved in some other community things in town,
Oh,
right?
AAUW.
What's that? I've heard of it, but I don't know.
Oh, American Association of University Women.
Mm-hmm. And what does the organization do?
Oh, we just have a monthly program open to the public at the various places.
Fantastic.
Usually of interest.
Great. Abe, what brings you out tonight?
Well, I guess I would echo the respect for your writing, and I'm a freelance writer myself, and always looking to learn more about the craft, and so I'm interested in what you have to say about it.
Thank you. What kind of doing interviews, what sort of challenges have you come up against?
I guess just sort of like getting at the thing I always want to do is get at those sort of most interesting parts of what someone's involved in and on top of them, and trying to figure out how to really help people open up about what they're doing is always seems like the essential challenge.
Right. And what have you had any aha moments where you're kind of arm wrestling in an interview and you're like, I don't know how to get this person to open up, and then you find it?
I've over time, one of the things that has I've realized is that if you can be comfortable with silence, that often can yield some really amazing material, because most people aren't that comfortable with silence. And so if you just let them speak and give them space, they often will be forthcoming, very forthcoming. So that's one aha moment for me. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. The young man sitting behind Abe, hi.
Hi, I'm not a journalist, but I do have some interest in writing and interpersonal interaction with my grandma.
Fantastic. Have you thought about thinking about interviews or just thinking about communication with people, conversation with people in general? Have you thought about more types of conversations you'd like to have, or is it feeling comfortable having conversations?
No, but I can imagine that there will be times in my life where I would want to learn from a person just as a journalist would.
That is one of the cool things about being a journalist, is all the different people you get to meet and talk to. It's like no 2 days are the same. Fantastic, thank you. So that was really simple and very quick, but those were basically 3 different interviews that once you get comfortable with kind of talking to people cold turkey, which just takes practice and just takes doing it, you can really sit down and get some very quick, very interesting information from anyone, even if it's not for a newspaper article. So it is something that I enjoy about my job, is getting to speak to all the different people about so many different things. So just a little quick synopsis of what brought me to the Commons and to interviewing, because I actually have a background in media, but in film and theater. I was a screenwriting major, I was a literature and writing major. Never wanted anything to do with journalism until I ended up back in the area through some very sad and tragic events, and really, really, really needed a job. So I called Jeff, because like Abe, Jeff and I all went to the same school. So I was hoping for just, you know, anything that would get me through until I could find something else, and then fell in love with the Commons and fell in love with interviewing. And what I love about interviewing is getting to hear stories that I didn't know were there, and getting to hear points of view that I had never considered. And I find that a very exciting opportunity to have, and I actually feel it's very important. And not to sound too puffed up, but it's kind of a sacred moment with someone when you're talking with someone and they share something, their point of view, their opinion, their take on a situation. I feel holding that space is actually quite sacred, and I consider it a responsibility and an opportunity, getting to have these conversations. So since I came to journalism cold, never having done it, I never had any training, and so I basically trained myself how to interview, which at times was a very awkward process, but it's okay, you survive. And I learned by watching a lot of other interviews and listening to a lot of interviews on radio and television, just to hear what type of questions were asked, how the interviewer behaved, how their posture, their body language, their tone of voice. But even though I spent a lot of time watching them, I still brought my screenwriting skills. And so I find that when I structure an interview, I structure it a lot like a screenplay. In that when I organize my questions like a shooting script or a storyboard. Those are things that filmmakers and writers use to structure the action in a film and the dialogue in a film. And I also tend to have some of the key points in my questions that you have in a screenplay, like introduction, getting to know the person, the midpoint, for anyone who knows writing, that's the center of the story. Climax is always the real tough questions or the real meaty questions, and then resolution is something I end with because I feel, especially if it's been a tough conversation, like if I'm calling up the director of finance at Brattleboro and saying, what's the town budget? That's not a real heart-wrenching interview. He'll give me some numbers, I'll ask him what they mean. But if I'm interviewing someone, like I've interviewed rapists, but I've also interviewed rape victims. And so I feel that you can't just, after talking about very tough things with people, just drop them. And say, thank you, have a very nice day. Now that I've made you open your heart, I'm just going to leave you out in the middle of the street. So I always have some kind of close down for interviews too, so that if it's been a tough interview, I know the person has kind of been taken care of and they're back on their feet, for lack of a better term. And it's interesting, because when I say that, I don't mean it's a lot of psychoanalysis. I'm not, trained in that. But I do just make sure that they're okay. And that if we've had a heated interview, like say with an elected official, which I've had, I still make sure that we have an okay professional relationship. Does that make sense so far? Any questions? Yes, madam.
Example. What was the question?
Oh, examples. Yes. So I interviewed some women a few years ago who had been in relationships that were very abusive. And they spent a lot of time answering my questions and describing these relationships to me. And at times there were tears, and at times there were these hard moments for them. And near the end, when I was reaching the close down, I just said, thank you for sharing this with me. This is I can realize that this took a lot to share this with me. Anything you want to add, you know, anything else you need to tell me, anything I can do for you right now before you go back to the rest of your day. And some of those women were just like, oh no, great, I'm fine. One of them actually said, you know, do you think we could just sit here for a couple minutes? And I said, sure, you can sit here for a couple minutes. So it's nothing really deep, it's just making sure you've kind of tidied up all the ends to make sure someone's not just walking back into their day. One interview I did with an elected official that did not go well. Even though he and I were on two very different sides of the situation, and we both knew we were on very different sides of the situation. Near the end of the interview, I said, thanks for taking the time. Although this has been a hard interview, I really appreciate your time. Anything else you wanted to add? And whatever happens next, I hope it works out for the best. And if I say something like that that's kind of encouraging, I won't say it unless I mean it. So even though I knew he would probably not be reelected, I still wanted things to work out for the best for him, you know. Because I do feel that we need to bring compassion to these interviews, even though a lot of times you're speaking with people who really rather just jumped out a second story window. You know, I've interviewed some people that when I step away from the interview, I think, whoa, like how do they live their lives with these belief systems? And the fact is they do. And they probably look at me and think, how does she get out of bed in the morning and like, you know, not get hit by a car because she can't navigate her life that badly? I'm sure they're thinking to that to some extent, but being in conversation with someone is, like I said, such a sacred moment that I feel the opportunity to create space for someone to speak whatever is on their mind or in their heart is really amazing. And so I think it's something we don't do enough of in our daily lives. So for me, what's an interview? I think a lot of people recognize that it's a conversation between two or more people, and you are trying to get information from someone. And sometimes it's very specific information, going back to the budget. You know, you want to know the amount of the budget, you want to know when it will go into effect, and you want to know how much more it was this year over last. Pretty straightforward. Sometimes it's more nebulous. You want to know someone's opinions, you want to understand why they did something. So they're all forms of conversation, but I look at the interview process as you're piloting this boat on this body of water. And depending what type of interview it is, depends what type of body of water it is. So a very straightforward interview might be the Whetstone Brook. Not Irene Whetstone, regular Whetstone. Something that's a much more deeper, broader subject might be the Connecticut. A deep, in-depth profile might be the ocean. And so each body of water has its own currents and its own way of moving through the landscape. And I think conversations do the same thing. So I think it's, too, with the ship in the water, it's a combination of structure and flow. So before you start your interview is the structure, and your boat is the structure. You think, what do I need to get from this interview? What do I have angles? Is there certain information I need to know? What questions do I need to ask? And you prepare and you do your research on the person. Like if it's an elected official, how long have they been in office? What issues have they stood for? How have they voted in the past? So your research and your questions and the type of article you're thinking of putting out, that's your structure. That's all your prep work. And then once you start the interview, you step into the water, or you're floating in the water, hopefully. And that's the flow. Because the person, you may go into the interview thinking, I'm going to ask about this, and suddenly there's a whole other story comes to the surface. And you have to go like, okay, and readjust to the currents. And so that's where listening is so important, is when you're in these interviews, listening to someone. It's not uncommon to ask a question and for someone to hear something else. Or you ask a question. This happened when I was preparing the VY story that's in. This week I was talking to one of the major engineers at Entergy, and he said, oh, we're down in the control room, and I said, oh, what's this button? Oh, I know, right? And he goes, oh, that's the blah, 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 and blah, 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 and I'm thinking, oh! How do you spell that? And what is it? And it does what? I thought it looked like a toaster. Okay. So you get all sorts of things. Or again, I was interviewing some Entergy employees, and the PR person told me, I've set up interviews with you with people who won't be staying on with Entergy. They're moving on, they're going to be unemployed, and that's their story. I went, okay. So I crafted these very careful questions, and they were deep and they were meaningful. And I show up and I ask my first question to the guy, and he goes, huh? I'm staying on at Entergy. I'm just at the jobs fair today because I want to keep my toe in the water. Okay, yeah. And I had on my feet to come up with a whole new set of questions. And I actually said, because I believe in being direct with the people you're interviewing, I actually said, okay, I was given a different piece of information, so let's stumble through this together now, shall we? We have 15 minutes. And it turned out to be a good interview. And it turned out to be an interview about what it means to uproot your young family and your wife from a job that she really loves when you're the primary breadwinner, and what it means to take your family from Keene to Michigan. I never saw that one coming. So that's about the flow, being ready to respond to people. And if you're listening to someone, and if you're giving them space to express themselves and be themselves, then you will always have a leg to stand on, because they're always going to give you something to work with. So what kind of drives me? I was watching, in preparing for this, I was watching a number of great interviewers who I admire conduct interviews, and wondering what drives me when I do interviews. And for me, it's curiosity. And I always, fingers crossed, like that, I hope that if I ask the right questions, I can get a story that no one considered before, or a point of view no one considered before, or I can give people a new point of view that we didn't see coming, and hopefully that new point of view will make things better, even if it's only for that person in that conversation. I can be an idealist, very much so. So that's what kind of drives me. I have another friend who's a journalist who what drives her is fighting injustice. So she is always looking for the thing she can tear apart and just go in for the juggler. It works for her. It's what drives her. And she's a very good journalist. And someone I respect, but it's just not what drives me when I'm in interviews. And I think that that's really important, that whenever you're sitting down with someone, to kind of know your style, and that there's no reason to be anything but the type of interviewer you are. I love Mike Wallace's interviews. I love how direct he is. I love the grin he gets on his face when someone becomes very passionate about something. But I don't know that I would ever be a Mike Wallace style of interview.
Who's on your list of great interviewers?
Well, I don't know if they're great. I should say the people I really enjoy and I learn a lot from. Mike Wallace. For entertainment, I really love the entertainment interviews that Tavis Smiley does. And I love how much he just will laugh and have a really good time. And I feel it always puts his audience at ease. I mean, as the person he's interviewing at ease really well. Even though I never liked The View, I do like Barbara Walters as an interviewer. I think one thing she's really good at is she'll ask the basic question, and then she's very good at finding the question that needs to come next, that takes things a little bit deeper. Bill Moyers is one of my favorite. I also really like him. Those are probably, for the long interviews, those are probably some of my favorites. And Terry Gross, I like her a lot as well. I think one thing she's great at is she always gives you just enough context when she's asking her questions, so that even if she's talking about something you've never heard about before, or a topic you're not, or I'm not versed in, I can always follow it. That's something I really feel with. Any questions so far? Yes, sir.
I was curious about when an interview suddenly like sort of goes sideways, you have to tear up what you prepared. Do you have a way or of sort of structuring your thinking about what the next set of questions are going to be? Like, is there a general way you approach that, or like, what are you thinking? How do you think about it?
Right. Well, first I have an absolute moment of panic.
Yes.
That I hope no one ever sees. And my mind will usually go completely blank, which is so unhelpful. But then I carry to, and I'm glad you brought this up because it was something I was going to mention later on, is I think part of developing your style as an interviewer, or someone who's holding conversations with people, is to figure out what your touchstones are. Like for me, what I'm always looking for is what is someone passionate about, or what is not being said. This happens a lot with, it happened a lot when I was covering the Brattleboro budget, actually, referendum. Regardless of where someone came down on the budget referendum, for those who don't know, Brattleboro passed its budget last March, and then through a special referendum it was defeated, and they had to restructure it and go on from there. There were a number of things that, even though everyone was talking about numbers, there was all these emotions under the situation that no one was talking about. And so in some of my interviews, that was the touchstone I was looking for, because the beliefs and the emotions and the hopes and fears that people were working with that had led to this whole referendum, I felt was really important. So yeah, what someone's passionate about, what's not being said, and then also because we're a weekly, the dailies in the area will always scoop us because they're just printing more and printing sooner. So I'm always looking for that point of view that hasn't been covered yet. So those are kind of my three touchstones that when everything goes to heck, I rely on. Yes?
I was going to say that it was sort of telling that all your favorite interviewers were radio or television personalities, and that the interviewing that goes on in print is so much more invisible.
Yes,
I mean, it's in
that's
the
a
story,
really good
but
point.
you don't see it as much.
Well, and I think that's why when I was trying to teach myself interviewing, I didn't really rely on a lot of print sources because I couldn't see what the interviewer was doing. And so for people you want to learn from, yeah, I do think you need to go to radio and television. Yeah. So, yes, sir.
You said something about like the different cultures of interviews. Like, I remember I heard one day one of those anchors on NPR interviewing the head of one of the big brokerage houses that had really arguably done some pretty awful things in terms of the world economy. And she was giving him softball questions, one after another after another. And then I think of like, a lot of times when I hear people on the BBC doing interviews, it's a really different culture of interview.
Yes.
It's respectful when people, you know, want to be interviewed by the BBC, but they don't back up a lot the way a lot of American interviewers do. And I'm just curious, you know, what maybe here it would be seen as a disrespectful interview or an ambush interview, but I don't really think that's what the BBC people are doing.
Right. You know, you bring up an interesting point, and I think the answer is multi-layered because I think your question is actually multi-layered in a sense that different papers have their own culture. So that will always play into the interview. For example, as the weekly, we ask different questions than the daily a lot of the time. But I also think, as you mentioned, in the US, some of what the BBC anchors do could be considered an ambush or disrespectful. I think sometimes in the US we use that as an excuse to not let the journalists do their job. I mean, to be very frank. But then also, yeah, so that's kind of the double-edged sword. Also, one magazine, or a newspaper, the Wall Street Journal doesn't ask questions the same way the New York Times does. So that kind of goes back to two different types of culture. Is there a way I can answer that a little deeper for you, or did you have a...
Have you gotten into interviews yourself that you find are kind of not adversarial, but where if you feel like your subject is just getting their talking points out,
Yeah.
stuff that they want the comments to be,
Yeah.
that you feel like your integrity as a professional drives you to push harder, even if it's going to damage your relationships, and maybe next time that company or firm or entity is not going to want to have the comments come into an interview because they're going to say, gee, Olga Peters really, she's rough. But, that's, do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, and the answer is yes. I've had every interview from, this was a few years about something that happened in Wilmington when the chamber was changing over their director, to put it mildly. I called one of the head of the board of, I think they're the board of trustees for the business chamber. So I called the president, and the first things out of her mouth was, well, you're a journalist and you want us to look stupid, so you're going to do everything possible to make us look stupid, so why do I really even want to talk to you? Because you're just, and she went on for like 10 minutes about what I was going to do to make them look stupid. And I think I had gotten as far as, hi, my name is Olga. So you come up, a lot of people's preconceived notions of what journalism is. I had one interviewee, I called for some very simple softball questions. I was asking him softball things because it was just for a profile that I needed some extra, stuff for. And I paused because he was on a bit of a stretch there with his language. And I was just pausing so he could get a breath. And suddenly he's yelling at me, saying, I know you're writing down everything I'm saying. Well, yeah, it's kind of how things get into print. And I know that even no matter what I say to you, you're going to write it down, so why should I put it off the record? And he's suddenly very angry at me for I don't know what. At least I think I was the innocent person here. So yeah, preconceived notions. I've had some entities who have written to me when I've asked for an interview. They say, yes, but you have to promise you'll write X, Y, Z. And I say, I'm sorry, I cannot promise that. They have never returned my call since. Yeah. And there's a couple entities in town that try to manage me very heavily. Does that help?
Mhm.
Yep.
Could I just add something? Hi,
This is Jeff.
I'm Jeff Potter. I'm the editorial director of one of Olga's editors. And I have to say that my first reaction, if we're confronted with something like that, is to say, no big deal. You know, this is, you know, if the price of having access to a source like that is guaranteed softball questions or the willingness to be manipulated, that's not a source that is ultimately in the best interests of the newspaper. I think something that should go without saying, but in this era has to go with saying, is good reporters need strong editors to back them up. And Randy and I try to be, as best we can, to give Olga the support that she needs to ask questions according to her conscience and not the public relations needs of her interviewees.
We actually had to do this last night. We received an offer to cover an event that looked very interesting. I actually wanted to cover it, but it came with the condition. One of the conditions, or two of the conditions, were I had to sign a non-disclosure form or a confidentiality form.
Something like that.
I don't know how you write an article after you've filled out such a form, for starters. But I also had to promise to write a newsworthy story about the event. And I thought, well, if it's going in the paper, isn't it going to be newsworthy? But we had to politely say thank you, but we can't ethically accept this. And that's going to be fun when they get that email.
So, is there a way that you approach it when there's a source that you really want to talk to who either wants to put really tough conditions on what they, sort of the nature of the interview, or just doesn't want to speak with you?
Mm-hmm.
Like, is there a way that anything you suggest in that, that might be persuasive or might, change their mind about speaking?
Right. It's really case by case. I mean, some people have given us conditions that we have met. For example, someone who has been the victim of a crime, and say, please don't use my full name because the person who did this to me is still out on the street. If it's protecting safety, I am more than happy to meet a lot of different conditions. When it comes to someone who doesn't want to speak for some reason, I personally, I don't know about my other friends who are journalists, I have a two-pronged approach. The first one is to be very direct and say, this is why I want to talk to you. And this is why I really hope you will speak with me. I've spoken to so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so. I'd really love your point of view because I think it will be different and very valuable for my readers. We talk about other things I've written, saying if you need to see my work, I'm happy to send you clips if you're feeling nervous. So there's that very direct approach. But the other approach is to always have a backup. Because sometimes someone will give you conditions that you just can't meet. Or they really just honestly don't want to talk to you. So you always kind of need, who's the next person on the list? Yeah. Yes?
Hi.
Hi.
I have a bunch, but I'll just do the next one. What do you do, or have you found in your interview that you're conducting, where you feel the conversations where someone just wants to please you? Is there seeking, like, because, sometimes I think, and when I've been conducting little things, people tell me what they think I want to hear, and it becomes sort of about relating to me.
Right.
I would like to recede a bit, but I get brought into, what do you,
Right.
how do I look good in your eyes, kind of undercurrent.
That doesn't happen often, but when it has happened, it's usually happened with someone who's not used to speaking with the press.
Okay.
And so for them, it's a very big day on their calendar. Not like we're the most important things ever, but they get to tell their story, someone's listening. Who doesn't love that moment? And so yes, they do start telling me what they think I want to hear. So the few times it's happened, I've handled it with, again, looking for my touchstones, trying to find where they're passionate, trying to find the different point of view. And I start working my questions towards that. I've even been direct and said, this is really wonderful info, but what do you think about that? That's really what I'm curious about. That would make me so happy to hear that. And so I try to create an environment where if they feel the need to tell me what I want to hear, I've created an environment where they telling me what I want to hear is the honest truth and their point of view. I think that's also a situation where follow-up questions are so important, and just saying like, that's wonderful, what did you think about that moment? Or, so tell me, what did it sound, what did you hear, and start relying on their senses, so they have to tell me a story. Rather than just give me, well, it was a Tuesday. So, yeah.
I was going to say, good questions are so essential.
Yeah.
And I think you have a good instinct for following up with good offbeat questions that keep that knock somebody off their, if they're trying to control the narrative. If you've got a good question they haven't even thought of.
Yes.
You know, the interview starts drifting into uncharted waters.
Jeff brings up a really good point. I've actually had conversations, and this happens mostly with people who are trained to handle the media, so communication specialists, PR people, where they're trying really hard to get their talking points in. I'll change the subject. Like I have really changed the subject sometimes where someone will be speaking, and I'll say, wow, that's really interesting. I seem to remember, you know, someone using an analogy about baseball and your topic. Like really bizarre, off the wall, complete change of subject, and it makes them kind of be like, what? What? And it's sometimes just enough of a break to shift the energy. So don't be afraid to, you know, talk about the weather if you have to. The weather can be an amazing thing when you need it to be. Just a little tip and trick for people, since we're talking so much about questions and organizing them ahead of time. It's not uncommon for me to organize my questions in about the same order I think they would appear in the article, so that I ask questions and get answers in roughly the structure I'm going to need in the end. So then all I have to do is go through my notebook, and it saves time for me rearranging and breaking down and shifting in the editing process. So that's just a little tip and trick I have found quite useful.
Do you record or do you write?
I write. There's, now that I'm getting into some more technical articles, I will probably record and write, just so I can get terminology and vocabulary down. There's also been some times, like when I was covering the march in 2012 from downtown to Entergy, when the original license ran out. I recorded that day because I was walking and moving, and I didn't want to trip over things while I was going. But in general, I tend to write for two reasons. One, when I write things down, I remember them better. And two, if the technology fails, I know right away. It's not like taking something and you think you just got this huge interview and you get back and the batteries had run out of the recorder. If the pen breaks down, I know.
So how do you stay engaged with your subject and write and make sure that you're getting accurately what they're saying? Do you have a shorthand that you use?
I do.
Or? Okay.
Yeah.
And that's something you developed, or
Yeah.
just what works for you?
Yeah. Actually, my handwriting's gotten so bad and I have so many forms of shorthand that when people look at my notebook, they think I've actually written in shorthand, like real trained shorthand. Yeah, it's something you develop, just like I shorten words like would and could become WLD, CLD. But as far as engaging,
Like if you're doing this, how do you maintain the conversation?
good point. So I use notebooks that are this size
Okay.
because I have very big handwriting. But it also means I can hold them and still see what I'm doing. So I don't tend to stand like this. I tend to hold the notebook down. I try to look up whenever I can and make eye contact. But I also engage a lot verbally. Like if I can't look up at that moment because I'm writing something, I'll go, huh, thank you, oh, great, discuss that. I'm really good at asking questions and writing at the same time. So that someone knows I'm still engaged, even if all they're hearing me is make little grunts and nods. Does that help?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah.
This is a bit about prep.
Okay.
Two things. One, when you're going through, you're researching someone, pretty much almost everything might have the same weight. I mean, they're all facts. And maybe something's coming up like timely, which would suggest a frame. But like with all of this at somewhat equal weight, how do you determine what the frame, what your focus is going to be for the interview? And then the second thing is, are you mostly often getting quotations or colorful commentary on things you already know because you found them out? Or are your questions generally to find out things you have no idea? And this research is a springboard into stuff that, who knows, that's...
Great question. I often ask questions about things I don't know. It's not uncommon in an interview for me to say to the interviewee, okay, this is the fact-checking portion of our conversation today. What's the total of the budget? What's the percentage increase over last year? And I kind of get those fact-checking questions out of the way first for two reasons. One, I have a tendency to want to forget them, so that way I know I haven't. But they also put the person at ease. So the person starts warming up, and they're talking about things they're used to talking about, and they're talking about things they know and understand. And then I save the more open-ended questions for the next part of the interview once it sounds like the person's feeling comfortable. One of the great ones is if someone's really nervous, the first question I'll ask them is, could you spell your name for me? Just to make sure I have it for later. But sometimes that's all I need to just start feeling comfortable. So, and about prep for framework, it's not uncommon for me to discuss the article with Jeff or Randy, my two editors, before I even start the research. And a lot of the questions are, gee, what's already been talked about? What haven't we considered yet? So part of that happens even before I start my research. But most of what I save for questions are things I don't know, because that's really what I'm curious about. Does that help answer your question? Yeah. Enough?
I just, I feel like not in the comments, but I feel like I can tell a lot of times sort of the purpose of some articles or some interviews and other places are, this is what we know about this person, but let's get them to say something funny about it, not something random. Like, it's not a discovery. And so that's what I just was wanted to feel you about.
I'm sure a lot of publications work that way. I would be bored out of my mind. And Jeff and Randy know I bored Olga is a very cranky Olga. So, no, I want new information whenever possible. I just want.
Can I follow up with that?
Sure.
Just ask, if you're getting new information, how do you determine on the fly how credible it is? Do you have tricks for for, for kind of quality control of that in that arena?
I do, and the quality control can be as direct as, how do you know that? Where did you find that? But also if it's something that could be problematic, and some people you're speaking to, they are the expert in their field. And so if they say it, it's probably very credible. But if I get a new piece of information that really sounds left field, I'll make more interviews, I'll do more research, I'll make more phone calls. And sometimes it's going back to the people I've already spoken to say, this new piece of information has arisen, what do you think? You know, is this your experience? I just want to go back to structure of interview really quickly, and before I forget, because I feel this is so important, I usually also finish an interview with two things. One, I always make sure I say thank you, even if, it's no matter how rough or how good the interview has been, I always say thank you. The other thing, this is my standard question that I end every interview with. I don't remember if I heard it from another interviewer, if it was a stroke of genius on myself. My guess is I heard it from someone else. And it often leads to some of the most interesting information I get is, thank you so much, it was great speaking with you. Anything else you wanted to add or wish I had asked? And you would be amazed what will often come from that last question. And it's actually my favorite, and that's why I use it every time. And I think I've covered most of what I wanted to talk about. And I would just, and then we can open it up to complete questions and answer. So I would just recommend going forward for anyone who wants to deepen their interview skills or build them, is to just listen to as many interviews as you can. Because I'll stand next to Tim Johnson, and we're covering the same event, speaking to the same people, and he will come up with a question I think, that was great. Or he'll ask it in a style that I hadn't considered. So you're constantly learning, and you're learning new techniques for dealing with different situations. Don't be afraid of the uncomfortable interview, because if you approach someone with respect and you give them the space to speak, you really can't fail. And that's again why I think that close down I spoke about earlier is so important, because that's where you kind of tighten up the ends and you give someone respect, you say thank you, and then no matter how hard the conversation had been, you end cleanly. Even if they don't ever want to speak to you again. You did your job. And then finding your own style is just practice. It's asking your grandparents, how they met. It's asking, one of the most interesting conversations I ever had with my grandfather, who has since passed away, was he had been an in-flight engineer in World War II, flew in the Pacific. And I knew this, he flew cargo planes out with supplies and brought wounded back. And I thought I knew what he thought of the presidents, and I thought I knew his political feelings. And then I said something one day, I asked why he enlisted. And he looked at me and he says, I was drafted. There's no way in hell I would do something just because a government told me to.
Wow.
Whoa! And we just went from there. So even with people you know and you talk to all the time, the right question can bring out a whole wealth of information. So accuracy is always key. But accuracy, there also needs to be experimentation and giving people space to speak. So that's kind of what I have right now, but questions? Any more questions? Yes, darling.
Have you ever been afraid of the people you interview.
Oh,
How do you feel
yeah.
about that?
Oh, yeah. I still get nervous, actually, even just for everyday phone calls. I still have to like count to 5 before I pick up the phone. I don't know, performance anxiety, I guess. But yeah, there have been people I was afraid to interview. Some of it was because they were convicted criminals.
Exactly.
And I didn't know where they were in their process, and so I didn't know if they were violent criminals, and I didn't know if where they were in their own process on that. I made sure I had some safeguards in place before I did the interview. I made sure my editors knew where I was going to be. I also gave them when I covered Occupy in New York City, my editors had the name of my doctor, all the names and numbers for my family, so they could contact. I let my family know where I was going to be. And I had, on my press pass, I had the phone number of legal aid and the NEMPA law hotline. And I memorized the NEMPA law hotline in case I had to make a phone call out in the middle of nowhere. Because I went about the time the police were starting to really crack down, and they were cracking down a lot on journalists, and I wasn't a New York City journalist, so I didn't know how they would respond to me. So yeah, I just put safeguards in place. And Brattleboro's such a small town, it's easy to find me, but I don't necessarily volunteer that information for someone who I feel might be unpredictable. Does that help?
Could you talk a little about going on the record and going off the record? And sometimes you have an anonymous source. It's tricky.
Yes, yes. So my editors can clarify this as well. So things are only on and off the record if the journalist agrees to it. So I've had a number of people in my life, in town officials and such, who will be talking, and then they'll talk for like 45 minutes, and then say, "Oh yeah, by the way, that was all off the record." No, no. And I actually have very little patience with that. So I'm very clear and upfront. I think most of the sources I speak to most of the time know what I think about that. So I admit that for sources I don't know, it's uncommon for me to go off the record with them. You kind of have to be someone who has been honest and upfront multiple times with me before I'm willing to go right off the record. If you're like a public official or an elected official, I'm a little more flexible on people who, for lack of a better term, could be considered civilians, who maybe don't understand the viper's nest they might be stepping into. So I'm a little more flexible there. But I'm pretty clear about on the record, off the record, and I choose when things go back on the record too. I'm just trying to think of examples, that's why I'm floundering a little bit. Anonymous sources. We've used a few, but not many. And it usually has to be a very good reason. And I have to clear it with my editor before I can promise that they can stay anonymous.
And I want to know who it is.
Yeah, my editor
It may
needs to know
not
who
appear
it
in
is.
print, but any source that she's interviewing, at least I know it's a real person, and I know the name of that person, and it's hidden away.
And if they want to be anonymous, unless I know who they are, we've actually checked people out before to see that they are real people, and that the name they're giving me is their real name. But then again, we're also pretty flexible. If someone might be in a position where they're a whistleblower,
Right, that's what I was thinking.
then I think that's where we're most open and flexible. Because I think if you're going to be a whistleblower, that is a very important responsibility. And you need all the support you can get. Does that help?
Not to be flip about it, but this is kind of, we take it one situation at a time. No
Yeah.
stories are going to be exactly, or circumstances are going to be exactly the same.
Yeah.
And so we go with our gut for what's right.
Mhm.
And we don't have any, someday we'll have written policies and,
Yeah.
under this, this is when we do, this is when we don't, et cetera. But for now, Randy or I will we'll just figure it out and have a good reason either way.
And we try to be pretty upfront with our readers too, like names have been changed to protect, or we don't release the name in this situation because, and we'll try to put it in the article so that the readers understand why we've decided to take this route. Does that help?
Mhm.
Perfect, thank you.
I'm not clear with this. Can
Okay.
someone, with agreeing to an interview and they understand all the rules and everything, call you up and say, never mind, you can't, I take it all back, if you print that, I'll say, you're making it all up? Like what,
They can do that.
okay.
I've never personally had that happen.
Does that mean you can't print something if
Yeah.
someone recants?
I might mention in the article that they then called me up and tried to recant.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to
Again,
see somebody try to do that.
Chain of evidence. And actually that's a good way of thinking about it. I try in my articles to always make sure there's some kind of chain of evidence. So if somebody wanted to do their own follow-up or look into a topic deeper, they can
I
understand.
don't know what's legal.
That's why you talk to editors.
Okay.
Or there's a reference that, remind me and I'll get the name of it for you, that has legal, it's for journalists and it's about legal law and their rights. I saw him.
Yeah, so do people often ask if they can read your interview before it's published?
Yes. Yeah, and that's a no-no. There may be other publications or news organizations that allow that, but for us,
And what's the reason for that?
people give me many reasons. Oh, you mean why do we
Yeah.
don't let them do that? It's influence. Undue influence.
First Amendment.
Yeah.
It's called prior restraint. And as keepers of the First Amendment, we have the first dibs on the story. And we're the ones who tell the story. And we reserve the right to tell the story the way we think it should be told, and the way the facts demand it to be told.
It's actually very insulting to ask a journalist to read.
Yeah, but what if the person feels they've been misquoted?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
It might be actually true, but they have been. How do they post it?
Then they
that.
can speak to the journalist, in this case me, and we can follow up. We have a very robust voices section, and so we would always invite them to write. And they could even write in the voices section, Olga's a horrible journalist and she lied the whole time and this is what I really meant. I feel that they have that right. And there has been occasions where I have called someone up and said, I have you saying this. Is that correct? I won't necessarily read the quote word for word back to them, but give them the gist. And I will do that on times if someone feels they've been abused by the press in the past. They might just do that as a karma care.
If you have your notes to back you up in the case of some assertion that you
Yeah.
got it wrong or whatever, well, it's written right here.
Yeah. And it can be tough too, because there's one person I interview on a regular basis because of their position in one of the towns I cover, who he's constantly calling me up and saying, you misquoted me. And I've gone to like BCTV and rewatched the video, and no, I haven't. I wrote down word for word what he said. The thing is, what he hears in his head, he's a much better writer than he is speaker. And so that's why it has to be kind of a case-by-case basis, and why the journalist has to keep kind of first dibs, because we're messy creatures, we human beings.
What's the latest in the ongoing thing about quotes? You know, how precise do they have to be? Word for word these days? Or, I mean, it used to be understood, maybe not in, day-to-day print journalism, but more commercial magazines and things like that, that You could alter the quote to a degree where you're taking the uhs, the ums, the hesitations, the bad grammar, and just trying to clean it up a little bit for readers. What's the latest on that?
Personally, I always try to do word for word. I will occasionally take out, like if someone said gonna instead of going to, I'll put in going to, in part because gonna can be confusing when you're reading it. But that's about pretty much all I'll do to a quote. Yeah, I usually try to, I try to preserve them as much as they can out of the person's mouth as humanly possible for me.
So this is another question about off the record, on the record. So in the last, I don't know, month or so, I've interviewed a couple of subjects who are involved in their own kind of media thing. Like they're coming out with a book, or they're involved in a television show or a movie. And sometimes it's sort of peripheral to the story. It's not the subject of the story, but it kind of comes up in the conversation, and then they say, oh, I can't have it on the record because they're involved in some sort of contract with whomever they're doing this project for, and they can't talk about it until it gets released.
That is such a pain. Yes, I know.
It's like, why did you say it in the first place? I feel like they've almost slipped, you know, and so how do you handle that? Has that ever come up for you?
It has. And in the times it's come up for me, what they've slipped on is not germane to my article. So I've let it go because it's not making a point, it's not adding anything. And also why get them in trouble with their book editor or their publishing house if it's not Watergate. You have to have priorities, I suppose. So I've been in positions where I can just kind of let that go because it's not germane. But if it was germane, I'd bring that up with them and say, well, this is really key to the article, so how do we make this work?
So it doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing. There can be.
No. Now, there are situations like if they were on trial for murder, and they said to me, yeah, I did kill the person. Oh, shoot, you weren't supposed to say that? I'd be like, headline, baby. You know, no. I mean, there are some things that are important and are important to people's safeties and well-being. I'm kind of a pain in the butt about that.
I know right now, female journalists reporting on video games are running into terrible persecution and
yeah, I've read some of
sexism,
those tweets.
and they're getting death threats and their addresses have been published. So apart from that, are you finding sexism in just being general, like
A general reporter?
yeah?
Not to the extent they are. For those who don't know, there's been some, like Gamergate was one issue where some women have commented on sexism in video games and just been dogpiled on the internet. Really horrible death threats and bomb threats and really out of proportion, I think, to the comments that were made.
And male journalists in the field making the same comments did not, you know, in their articles.
They didn't get the same response, yeah. I have experienced sexism, but yeah, nowhere near that level. I think some of the most interesting sexism I've experienced is when sources look at me and they say, oh, she's just a girl, and she's cute, and she's nice, and then I ask hard questions, and I don't do what they want me to do, and I don't write what they want me to write, and they get so mad at me because I'm not behaving, and then suddenly I become confrontational. I'm looking at Jeff and Randy because they've gotten these calls. Let's see, confrontational, argumentative.
I haven't gotten one of these calls in a long time.
Well, that's because that person stepped down from their post. But that's usually what, and I do notice from time to time if I'm interviewing a man who's taller than me that the vision's going here. And I have noticed in group interviews that the male journalists are answered first. And I will ask a question, and then I'll ask the same question, and I'll ask it again, and then suddenly one of the male journalists will ask the same question, and it's like, oh, good question, I'm so glad you asked that. And it's like, what? I'm here. And
so less aggression and more of
more like, good little girl, go play with your dollies. And I guess I've always dealt with it on a case-by-case basis. I've never dealt with it directly, like I've never said to a source, you're being sexist. Mainly because it's a conversation I don't feel like having with them. But my main way of dealing with it is to just not back down. And that's probably just as much my personality. There was one source that was looking so hard down my top that I said, and he wasn't answering my questions. So I said, okay. So instead of covering myself or stepping back and kind of I just let him keep looking until he was so distracted that I just started asking questions and he answered them because he wasn't paying attention. And I went, there you go, see? You don't pay attention? And that was a moment of petty revenge, I admit. And it was kind of felt good.
I think that points out something that really you do very well, which is maintain a sense of diplomacy. Well, that's probably not ultimately not the example, but the fact that you put up with that and then leveraged it to get your story. I can't tell you the number of times you have had such a calm and even and calming affect on the phone, and then you'll hang up the phone and say, bloody hell!
Well, you bring up a good point, and I think the reason I do work so hard to maintain, for lack of a better term, the sense of diplomacy, I call it detachment, in the kind of meditative sense, is no matter what I think of the situation, it's not about me. It's not about me. I can be as angry, I can be as happy, I can love my source, I can hate my source. It doesn't matter because it's not about me. It's about getting the best information for my readers as possible. And I think that's why I'm able to let go of a lot of things that would probably keep me up at night out of sheer blind rage. Yeah, because it's not about me. Yes?
This is a question about fact-checking,
Yes.
and maybe this is as much as for you as for the editorial folks here. You know, there've been stories even in the Times. We've seen things where people have run a line on a reporter, and it escaped their fact-checking, and it was pretty bad news for the public and for the paper and whatever. What process do you as a reporter or you folks editorial have to do fact-checking?
A number, I tend to, I'll let Jeff and Randy answer this too. I use a number of different approaches. One is the multiple interviews. And if there's information that I think is really key, when is Vermont Yankee closing? That's something, that's a date you might really want for an article. I'll ask the same question to multiple people. And if I don't get the same answer multiple times, research is another way. I try to do as much research as I can, and that amount will vary depending on how much time I have. But there's that. Randy has an encyclopedic memory of this area, So he's a great fact checker just because it's all there. But yeah, multiple interviews and research were probably my go-tos.
And after that, multiple layers of editing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Generally, Randy's edited it once. If I have an interest in it, I try to look at all the front page stories that our reporters do. John is generally our copy editor who reads almost all the news in the paper with a fastidious attention to detail. But speaking for myself, when I copy edit something, I will try to. Number one, I trust our reporters. You probably by now you've heard this process, and I have faith that when Olga hands in something, it's going to be substantively true. What I try to do is I try to back that up and make sure that there aren't little errors that are going to be embarrassing. I will try to double check every checkable fact that's written, and get some sort of credible source online to and then I'm talking about spellings of proper names, spellings of the dates. You check them, I check them too.
Yep. Oh, no, that's good.
And somehow we end up with something that I hope is we're still human and we still make our share of errors, as does any newspaper, but it's something that's very carefully done.
We'll also print corrections if we've made a mistake. And I've had some articles where I've written the same fact many times and then find new information, and I'll write, unlike what was previously reported, da-da-da-da-da. And then bang my head against the wall because I'm usually so angry I didn't catch the mistake in the first place. Yes?
Some journalists and publications, especially very famous ones here in the United States at least, have a problem with what's called unbiased bias, where there will be a fact or a perspective, and the only person you can find who disagrees with that is a whack job.
Yeah.
Or they have a statement, they need a counterpoint, so they will treat lies as an opinion. How do you keep that in check, keep that in mind, deal with that?
Yeah,
where does it come up?
Pardon?
I was just going to say, I can't imagine in like I only walked in here, so I don't know exactly what's going on, but I'm going to say, or the question could be like, where does that non-biased bias come in?
The most
like what kinds of writing?
The most
as
famous
a journalist?
example is NPR. They brought in an expert once who specialized in journalistic bias, and they did this interview, and at the end they said, well, what's the verdict? Everybody says we have this liberal bias. What's the verdict? What's our bias? And he said, well, we have two biases.
Mama.
One is a pro-peace bias. You're always going to be favorable to whoever is working towards peace and a conflict. And the other is you have an anti-bias bias. If you did a story on World War II, you would say that's an interesting perspective. Now for a counterpoint, we have Mr. Adolf Hitler.
Yeah, no, you bring up a very good point. And I have a number of different answers to it. One is I do trust my readers. And so I feel if there's something that comes up that I have to have 2 points of view for some reason, I trust them to read and digest and do their own thinking about information I present. But it's an interesting question, and the reason I'm floundering is because I've been wrestling with it too, about how, because I have some big stories coming up that has some very definite bias in the community, so I've been wrestling with this.
About balanced reporting.
Yeah, and I think it's a case-by-case basis. Like, we have made decisions in the newsroom where we've decided you know what, we've reached a point on, say, climate change, that we feel that it does exist, and we don't need to hear the people telling us it doesn't. But then it's case by case. So if I was doing an interview on climate change where I felt another point of view was needed, I would bring that in. But the main way I handle it is I try to get, when possible, on the bigger pieces, I try to get more than 2 voices. I try to get 3 or 4 whenever possible. But it's a hard nut, because as a journalist, I'm constantly looking at my work saying, okay, are any of my biases in here? You know, am I trying to turn my audience one way or the other? And so I think it's something that, at least as a journalist, I do daily, probably sometimes better than others. Yes?
I know we've gone a little bit over time. The questions we're fielding are so interesting. I wanted, though, to just commend you, from my point of view as the copy-editor of the paper, and so who reads the paper with a loving eye. You cover so much ground. You are at meetings, you're talking to people all the time, and just the wealth and volume of material you bring back to readers never ceases to amaze me. You can shift gears from different kinds of interviews and different kinds of interviewees in different settings, and you kind of weave it all together under deadline so well. So I'm just so impressed with it. And thank you for doing what you do.
Thank you. I blush.
Oh.
Yes, we are over time, but I'm happy to stay if people have more questions or there's more they need answered.
I just wanted to ask you if you would tell us about maybe an interview you'd like to share, either something that was super challenging, or you really enjoyed, or that you're really proud of, or whatever.
Oh, thank you. That's so sweet. Well, one interview that was very challenging I had about a year ago was similar to the one that happened at BY. I was told that someone had been a town manager of Brattleboro, so I called them up to get this great perspective and historical, beautiful perspective on Brattleboro and how it's changed and its new challenges. And he calls me back and he says, I was never town manager. And we're like, oh, huh, I'm on deadline. And I had to, you know, change gears and find a whole new interview. One that I'm most proud of. One that I'm proud of simply because it pushed me so far out of my comfort zone. I think I'd been working for the Commons, I think we'd gone weekly, but it was it the 1 year or 2nd year anniversary of
the stabbing on Elliott Street.
Right.
And
it was just after we went weekly,
right.
2010.
And it was the first year anniversary of the stabbing.
Mm-hmm.
And you had to go out and talk to the family members.
They were holding a vigil
from
on Elliott Street.
Transportation Center on Elliott Street.
Yep. And I hadn't done, up to that point, any kind of emotional interview up to that point. And I approached the woman, and she was in tears. You know, she's still mourning the death of her son. That was an interview I was very proud of because, and actually that's the interview that taught me the importance of what I call the close down, because she was crying and doubled over with grief still. And I think I walked away having kind of made sure she was still okay before I left. So that's an interview I'm proud of, and it really pushed me out of my comfort zone.
I'm wondering, as a journalist, how you see, because what came to mind there when you said what experiences brought you out of your comfort zone, was that there's a lot to be said for like the healing power of testimony, or like how people need to kind of talk about what they're not just like tough issues like that where someone's grieving. So I'm wondering, like, if you see your journalism career kind of staying in the community, or eventually diving further into the community in like a expose book sort of way, or like like getting into more controversy. Like, have you been like being so kind of not enthralled, but I'm enthralled by you. Being so like, yeah, just kind of ingrained in the community. Do you have the time or like to set us like to be having these wild dreams about where your future could be, or are you kind of like, there's enough going on right now?
There's enough going on right now to keep me busy for at least a few months. You know, you bring up a really good point because there is so much going on in this community, Brattleboro in general, but Wyndham County, which is what our paper focuses on. And it's an interesting balance because on the one hand, it's dance between staying objective and therefore a little back, and at the same time, because I live here and this is my home, I'm also really embedded. I'm an embedded journalist in many ways in this community, and I love the thought of an expose book because I think there's so many stories going on in this town alone and this county in general that just aren't being told. And I personally feel that everyone has a story to tell.
Yeah. And you think you could someday, theoretically, be the person to bring out a story that somewhere?
If that happened, I'd be very honored. Yeah.
Or maybe a novel.
Oh, I got that in the drawer.
This is Brattleboro, it's stranger than fiction.
Yeah. Novels would be good, because in a way you can tell different types of truth with fiction.
Yeah.
Tell fact with journalism, truth with fiction. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I wonder if, the thing about my career, my work, mistakes that I've made along the way are really like huge learning things. Often there's not the safety in the community or the profession you're working into. Be honest about the mistakes. But I wonder if you can think, like maybe early in your career or sometime in your career, where you blew it or you made a mistake on an interview that you really read and you learned so much from that. Does anything come to mind about that?
Yeah, I think one of my biggest learning curves was learning to not want to make the interviewee happy. And learning how to be comfortable with uncomfortable conversations. And while I was learning how to do that, it was messy sometimes. You know, I asked questions with not as much tact as perhaps they needed. And I didn't say thank you at the end of the interview. So I think that's the biggest. Okay,
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.